Picture this. You've spent 5 years being the perfect supportive wife while your husband builds his career and treats you like you're invisible. You trust him with everything, your future, your finances, your heart. Then one day you discover he's been living a completely different life behind your back, spending thousands of dollars on another woman while telling you money is tight. Most women would just leave and hope for the best in divorce court. But what if you had a secret weapon he never saw coming? What if the helpless housewife he'd been underestimating actually had the power to freeze every single account, expose every lie, and watch his entire world crumble with just 3 phone calls? My name is Jessica, and this is the story of how I went from being financially abused to financially free, and why my ex-husband is still calling me begging to work things out 6 months later. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My story begins in a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, in suburban Denver, Colorado, where I lived for 5 years, as a woman who had somehow become a stranger in her own life. The house itself was nothing special. Beige siding, a small front yard that I maintained myself, and a driveway that barely fit our 2 cars. But to me, it represented everything I thought I wanted. Stability, family, the American dream wrapped up in a 30-year mortgage, and matching appliances. I'm Jessica Chen, though for 5 years I went by Jessica Anderson, having taken my husband's name like the traditional wife I thought I was supposed to be. Before this story began, before I became the woman who learned to fight back, I was someone who prided herself on being agreeable, supportive, and understanding. I was the kind of person who always said yes when asked for favors, who remembered everyone's birthdays, and who genuinely believed that if you just worked hard enough and loved deeply enough, everything would work out fairly in the end. At 32 years old, I had spent the last 5 years of my life perfecting the role of the devoted wife and mother. My days followed a predictable routine that had become as comfortable as it was suffocating. I would wake up at 6 in the morning to pack my husband Mike's lunch, prepare his coffee exactly the way he liked it, 2 sugars, a splash of cream, and make sure his work clothes were pressed and ready. While he showered, I would start breakfast and wake up our 4-year-old daughter Emma, helping her choose an outfit and brushing her long brown hair into neat pigtails. Mike Anderson was a regional sales manager for a mid-sized tech company downtown, and in the 5 years we'd been married, I'd watched him climb from junior account representative to managing a team of 12 people. He was good at his job, charming and persuasive in the way that made clients trust him and colleagues respect him. Standing 6 feet tall with sandy brown hair and the kind of confident smile that had first attracted me to him at a coffee shop near the University of Denver 7 years ago, Mike looked every inch the successful businessman he'd worked so hard to become. Our neighbors on Maple Street saw us as the perfect young family. Mike would leave for work each morning in his pressed shirts and tailored slacks, carrying the leather briefcase I'd bought him for his 30th birthday. I would wave goodbye from the front porch, usually wearing yoga pants and a ponytail, Emma balanced on my hip as we watched Daddy drive away in his silver Honda Accord. To anyone watching from their kitchen windows, we looked like a scene from a suburban catalog. But what our neighbors couldn't see was how small I had become in my own life. Somewhere between getting married and having Emma, I had stopped being Jessica Chen, the woman who had her own opinions, her own career, her own dreams, and had transformed into Mike's wife, Emma's mother, the woman who existed primarily in relation to other people's needs and expectations. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It was so gradual that I barely noticed it happening, until I woke up one morning and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd made a decision that was entirely my own. When we went out to dinner, Mike chose the restaurant. When we watched television, he controlled the remote. When we talked about our future, the conversation always centered around his career goals, his timeline, his vision of what our family should look like. I told myself this was normal, that this was how marriages worked. Mike had the demanding job that required long hours and constant attention. It made sense that I would handle everything else: the household management, the child care, the social calendar, the extended family obligations. I was good at these things, and I found genuine satisfaction in creating a comfortable home environment where Mike could relax and Emma could thrive. But as the months turned into years, I began to feel like I was disappearing. Not just from the professional world I'd once been part of, but from my own sense of who I was as an individual. I would catch glimpses of myself in the bathroom mirror and feel surprised by my own reflection, as if I were looking at a stranger who happened to live in my body. The financial arrangement we'd settled into only reinforced this dynamic. When we first got married, Mike had suggested we combine all our accounts for simplicity's sake. "It's easier to manage our money together," he'd said, and it had seemed like a romantic gesture at the time, the final step in truly joining our lives. I'd closed my individual checking and savings accounts and moved everything into joint accounts with both our names on them. In theory, this meant we both had equal access to our money. In practice, Mike handled all the financial decisions. He paid the bills, managed the investments, decided how much we could afford to spend on groceries, clothes, or household items. I had a debit card linked to our joint checking account, but I rarely used it for anything beyond Emma's needs and basic household expenses. Mike had made it clear that any significant purchases should be discussed with him first, and his definition of, quote, significant seemed to shrink smaller every year. "We need to be careful with our spending," became his standard response whenever I mentioned wanting something. New clothes, a weekend trip, repairs to the house that seemed minor to him, but important to me. "Money's tighter than you think, Jess. The mortgage payment, Emma's daycare, the car payments. It all adds up faster than you realize." I accepted this explanation because I wanted to be a responsible partner. I didn't push back when he suggested I shop at discount stores instead of the places I used to enjoy. I didn't complain when he decided we couldn't afford the family vacation we'd talked about, or when he said Emma's birthday party needed to be smaller and simpler than I'd hoped. I trusted that Mike understood our financial situation better than I did, and I believed that being a good wife meant supporting his decisions even when they disappointed me. What I didn't realize at the time was how this arrangement was changing the fundamental balance of power in our relationship. By giving up control over our finances, I had inadvertently given up my voice in almost every important decision that affected our family. I had become financially dependent in a way that went far beyond not having my own income. I had lost the ability to act independently, to make choices about my own life without needing Mike's approval and access to money he controlled. This dependency extended into every corner of our daily life together. When Emma needed new clothes, I had to explain to Mike why the expense was necessary. When my car needed repairs, I had to justify the cost and timing. When I wanted to meet friends for lunch or coffee, I found myself calculating whether the expense would seem reasonable to Mike, whether he might comment on money being wasted on unnecessary social activities. Gradually, I stopped suggesting things I wanted to do or buy. It was easier to avoid the conversation entirely than to risk Mike's disapproval or his lectures about fiscal responsibility. I learned to anticipate his responses, to edit my own desires before I even expressed them. I became an expert at finding free activities for Emma and me, at making our grocery budget stretch further, at finding creative ways to manage our household needs without asking for additional money. The irony was that Mike often praised me for being so good at managing on a budget, so resourceful and uncomplaining about money. "You're amazing, Jess," he would say when I managed to throw together a nice dinner from whatever was left in our refrigerator, or when I found a way to redecorate Emma's room using things we already owned. "I don't know how you do it," but what felt like praise often carried an undertone that made me uncomfortable, as if my ability to make do with less was more important to him than whether I was happy or fulfilled. He seemed to appreciate me most when I needed the least from him, when I could take care of everything without requiring his attention, his time, or his money. This dynamic became especially clear during Emma's early years. Mike loved being a father in the abstract. He was proud to show her off to his colleagues, he enjoyed playing with her when he was in the mood, and he definitely enjoyed the social status that came with being a family man. But the daily reality of parenting, the constant needs and demands and expenses that came with raising a child, seemed to overwhelm and irritate him. "Can't you handle this yourself?" became his standard response when I tried to involve him in decisions about Emma's care, her schedule, her needs. "I work all day, Jess. When I come home, I just want to relax. Isn't this stuff what you're home for?" So I handled it myself. I researched daycares and preschools, made all of Emma's medical appointments, dealt with her sleep problems and eating phases and behavioral challenges. I became the primary parent by default, not because we'd discussed and agreed on this arrangement, but because Mike simply opted out of most parenting responsibilities, and I filled the vacuum his absence created. The weight of this responsibility was heavier than I'd expected, not just the practical demands of caring for a young child, but the emotional weight of feeling like I was raising Emma essentially as a single parent, while living with a husband who seemed to view both of us as burdens he had to support, rather than family members he wanted to prioritize. Mike's work schedule became increasingly demanding as he advanced in his career, or at least that's how he explained his longer and longer absences from home. "I have to put in the hours now if I want to make partner," he would say, leaving early in the morning and returning late in the evening. Weekend work became more common, and business trips stretched from overnight affairs to 3- and 4-day commitments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I supported these career demands because I believed we were building something together, that Mike's professional success would eventually benefit our whole family. I took on even more of the household and parenting responsibilities so that he could focus entirely on work without worrying about anything at home. I became expert at handling everything that might otherwise require his attention: Emma's schedule, social obligations, household repairs, family relationships. But as Mike's career flourished, I began to feel like I was being left behind rather than supported. His world was expanding, while mine was contracting. He had interesting colleagues, challenging projects, business trips to new cities, professional achievements that brought recognition and advancement. My world consisted of the same 4 walls, the same daily routines, the same limited circle of other mothers I encountered at the park or grocery store. I tried to express these feelings to Mike, but he seemed genuinely confused by my dissatisfaction. "You have everything you wanted," he would remind me. "You get to stay home with Emma instead of working some stressful job. You have a nice house, a reliable car, financial security. What more do you need?" The question stung because I couldn't articulate what I needed in a way that made sense to him. How could I explain that I felt like I was disappearing, that I missed having my own professional identity, that I wanted to feel like an equal partner in our marriage instead of a dependent he supported? These complaints seemed ungrateful when Mike was working so hard to provide for us, selfish when he was under so much pressure at work. So I stopped complaining and tried harder to appreciate what I had. I focused on the positives: Emma's bright smile and infectious laughter, the moments of peace I found in our quiet house, the security of knowing our bills were paid and our future was planned. I told myself that this phase of my life was temporary, that when Emma started school, I would figure out how to reclaim some sense of my own identity and purpose. But deep down, I was beginning to suspect that the woman I used to be, confident, independent, professionally accomplished, might be gone forever. And that possibility scared me more than I was willing to admit, even to myself. And for the first time in years, I felt like myself again, competent, analytical, and completely unwilling to accept anything less than the truth. The confrontation with Mike lasted 3 hours and left me feeling like I had been living with a stranger for the past 5 years. What I discovered during that painful conversation was that the man I had married was not only capable of extensive financial deception, but he was also skilled at emotional manipulation in ways that I was only beginning to understand. Mike's initial strategy was to minimize the severity of what I had uncovered, while simultaneously making me feel guilty for investigating our joint finances without his permission. He kept returning to the theme that I had violated his privacy and broken his trust by snooping through his personal papers and accessing accounts that he had been managing responsibly on both of our behalves. "I can't believe you would go behind my back like this," he said, looking at the financial documents spread across our coffee table with an expression of wounded betrayal. "We're supposed to be partners, Jess. Partners don't spy on each other." But I had spent 3 weeks preparing for this conversation, and I wasn't going to be distracted by his attempts to make me the villain in a situation where he was clearly the one who had been lying and hiding information. "Partners also don't lie about money," I replied calmly. "Partners don't transfer $20,000 into secret accounts." What Mike never bothered to learn about me during our marriage was that I hadn't always been the compliant housewife he'd grown accustomed to controlling. Before I became Mrs. Anderson, before I learned to ask permission for grocery money and apologize for wanting things, I was Jessica Chen, and Jessica Chen had been nobody's dependent. I grew up in a family where financial literacy wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. My parents, both immigrants from Taiwan, had arrived in America with engineering degrees and an unshakable belief that economic independence was the foundation of every other kind of freedom. My mother, Lynn, worked as a software engineer for a telecommunications company, while my father, David, managed supply chains for a major manufacturing firm. They met in a graduate economics course at the University of Colorado and bonded over spreadsheets and investment strategies. Money was never a taboo subject in the Chen household. Every Sunday morning, my parents would sit at our kitchen table with their coffee and review our family's financial position. They discussed interest rates, market trends, retirement planning, and college savings, with the same matter-of-fact tone other families used to talk about weekend plans or television shows. By the time I was 12, I could calculate compound interest in my head and understood the difference between stocks and bonds. Money is a tool, my mother would tell me while teaching me to balance a checkbook. But only if you understand how to use it. The moment you stop paying attention to your finances is the moment someone else starts making decisions about your life. This philosophy shaped everything about how I approached my education and early career. I majored in accounting at the University of Denver not because I was passionate about numbers, though I discovered I had a natural aptitude for them, but because I understood that financial expertise would give me options and security that nothing else could guarantee. While my classmates complained about the dry material and endless calculations, I saw every class as a step toward the kind of independence my parents had modeled for me. My first job after graduation was with Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm in downtown Denver that specialized in small business consulting and tax preparation. The work was challenging and varied. One day I might be helping a restaurant owner understand their cash flow problems. The next I could be preparing tax returns for a local construction company or auditing the books for a nonprofit organization. I loved the detective work aspect of accounting, the way numbers told stories about people's lives and business decisions. A sudden spike in travel expenses might reveal a company's expansion plans. Irregular payroll patterns could indicate cash flow problems or seasonal business cycles. Unexplained credit card charges often pointed to fraud or personal expenses being inappropriately charged to business accounts. My colleagues at Morrison & Associates quickly recognized that I had a talent for spotting inconsistencies and asking the right questions. Within 2 years, I was handling some of the firm's most complex audits and had developed a reputation for being thorough, discreet, and surprisingly compassionate when dealing with clients who were facing financial difficulties. You have a gift for making people feel safe enough to tell you the truth, my supervisor Margaret Morrison told me during my third-year performance review. That's rare in this business. Most people see accountants as intimidating or judgmental. You make them feel like you're on their side. This skill served me well as I advanced within the firm. By my 4th year, I was being considered for a partnership track position, a significant achievement for someone my age in a competitive field. I had my own office, a steady stream of client referrals, and was earning a salary that allowed me to live comfortably in my own apartment, drive a reliable car, and save aggressively for my future goals. More importantly, I had complete control over my own financial life. I maintained multiple savings accounts for different purposes: emergency fund, vacation fund, professional development, future home down payment. I contributed the maximum amount to my 401k, invested in a diversified portfolio of mutual funds, and even owned a small rental property that generated passive income. At 27, I was financially secure in a way that many people twice my age never achieved. I also maintained detailed records of everything. Not out of obsession or paranoia, but because my accounting background had taught me that documentation was protection. I tracked every expense, saved every receipt, and reconciled my accounts monthly. I knew exactly how much money I had, where it was invested, and what my financial trajectory looked like for the next decade. This meticulous approach to personal finance management was second nature to me, as automatic as brushing my teeth or checking my email. I couldn't imagine living any other way. Couldn't fathom how people manage their lives without understanding their own financial position. The idea of letting someone else control my money would have seemed as absurd as letting a stranger choose my clothes or decide what I ate for dinner. When I met Mike at a coffee shop near campus in the spring of my 5th year at Morrison & Associates, I was attracted to his confidence and ambition, but I never considered compromising my financial independence for anyone. Mike was working as a junior sales representative for a small tech company, and while he was charming and good-looking, he was also clearly struggling financially. He lived in a studio apartment with a roommate, drove a car that was perpetually breaking down, and often suggested coffee dates instead of dinner because restaurants were outside his budget. None of this bothered me. I respected that he was working hard to build his career, and I appreciated that he was honest about his financial limitations instead of trying to impress me with money he didn't have. What I found attractive was his drive and his vision for his future. Mike talked about his career goals with the kind of passion and specificity that suggested he would achieve them. Our early relationship was remarkably equal. We alternated paying for dates based on who had suggested the activity and what each of us could afford. I would take him to nice restaurants when I wanted to celebrate something or try a new place. He would plan creative, inexpensive dates, hiking trips, picnics in the park, free concerts and art exhibitions. We both contributed to the relationship in ways that matched our respective resources and abilities. When Mike got promoted to account manager and moved into his own apartment, I helped him understand how to set up a budget and manage his increased income responsibly. When I was considering whether to accept the partnership track position at Morrison & Associates, he listened to me analyze the pros and cons and supported whatever decision I thought was best for my career. For the first 2 years we dated, I never felt pressure to change anything about my financial habits or career ambitions to accommodate Mike's preferences. He seemed to respect and even admire my professional success and financial discipline. He would brag to his friends about dating, quote, the smartest woman in Denver, and would ask for my advice when he was making important financial decisions. The shift began so gradually that I didn't recognize it as a shift at all. It started with small suggestions that seemed motivated by care and concern for our relationship. When I was working long hours during tax season, Mike would point out how stressed I seemed and suggest that maybe I was pushing myself too hard. When I traveled for work to audit clients in other cities, he would mention how much he missed me and wonder aloud whether the professional benefits were worth the time we lost together. I just want to make sure you're not sacrificing your personal happiness for your career, he would say, and the sentiment seemed so thoughtful and caring that I didn't recognize it as the beginning of a campaign to reshape my priorities. The suggestions became more specific as our relationship became more serious. Mike would point out that the partnership track position would require even longer hours and more travel. He would mention news articles about successful women who regretted not starting families earlier. He would talk about his own desire to have children someday and wonder whether 2 demanding careers would be compatible with the kind of family life he envisioned. None of these conversations felt manipulative at the time. Mike presented his concerns as things to consider rather than ultimatums, and he always emphasized that he wanted me to be happy above all else. But gradually I began to see my career through the lens of how it affected our relationship, rather than how it fulfilled my own goals and interests. When Mike proposed after 3 years of dating, I accepted enthusiastically. I loved him, I could envision a happy future together, and I appreciated that he had waited to propose until he was financially stable enough to contribute equally to our shared expenses. We spent months planning a wedding that reflected both of our personalities and stayed within a budget we had developed together. But it was during the wedding planning process that Mike first suggested combining our finances. It seems silly to maintain separate accounts when we're building a life together, he argued. How can we plan for our future if we're still thinking in terms of my money and your money? The suggestion made logical sense, and it seemed like a natural step in the progression of our relationship. We were getting married, we would be sharing a household, and making joint financial decisions about everything from mortgage payments to vacation plans. Combining our accounts would simplify bill paying and budgeting. But I also felt a flutter of anxiety about giving up the financial independence that had been so fundamental to my sense of self. I suggested a compromise. We could open joint accounts for shared expenses while maintaining individual accounts for personal spending and savings. This would give us the benefits of simplified household management while preserving some individual financial autonomy. Mike's response was the first clear indication that his vision of marriage was different from mine. "Jess, that's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps couples from really becoming a team," he said. "If we're still hiding money from each other, if we're still thinking like single people, how can we ever truly be partners?" The word hiding stung, because it wasn't how I thought about maintaining individual accounts. I wasn't trying to hide anything from Mike. I was trying to preserve some independence and control over my own financial decisions. But Mike framed this desire as selfish and inconsistent with true marital partnership. I want us to be completely transparent with each other, he continued. I want to know that we're both equally committed to our shared goals, that neither of us is keeping anything back or making financial decisions without considering how they affect both of us. Put that way, my reluctance to combine our accounts seemed petty and paranoid. What did I think I needed to hide from my husband? Why was I so afraid to trust the man I loved enough to marry? Mike made it clear that separate accounts would signal a lack of faith in our relationship, a hedge against the possibility that our marriage might fail. So I agreed to combine everything. We closed our individual accounts and opened new joint accounts with both of our names. We combined our savings, merged our investment portfolios, and applied for credit cards that would be linked to our shared credit history. On paper, we both had equal access to all of our money and equal authority to make financial decisions. The practical reality, however, was that Mike immediately took over managing our combined finances. He argued that it made sense for one person to handle bill paying and investment monitoring, and since he had more time in his schedule, he would take on these responsibilities. I could focus on other aspects of running our household, meal planning, cleaning, social calendar management, while he handled the financial administration. At first, this division of labor seemed efficient and logical. Mike was organized and detail-oriented when it came to bills and budgets. He set up automatic payments for all of our recurring expenses, researched better insurance rates, and monitored our investment accounts more actively than I had been doing. Our financial life seemed to run smoothly without requiring much input from me. But gradually I realized that not requiring input from me had transformed into one not allowing input from me. When I wanted to make a significant purchase, Mike would ask me to justify the expense and explain how it fit into our budget priorities. When I suggested changes to our investment strategy or savings goals, he would explain why my ideas weren't practical given our overall financial picture. Most troubling was that I began to lose track of our actual financial situation. Mike would tell me that money was tight when I wanted to spend on something he considered unnecessary, but I couldn't verify this myself because he had taken over all of the account monitoring and bill paying. I had access to our accounts in theory, but in practice, I had stopped paying attention to our day-to-day financial management. This loss of financial awareness accelerated after Emma was born and I transitioned to staying home full-time. Without my own income, I felt less entitled to question Mike's financial decisions or to push back when he said we couldn't afford something I wanted. He was the one earning money, so it seemed reasonable that he should have more authority over how we spent it. But what I didn't realize at the time was that Mike had systematically dismantled all of the financial independence and expertise that had once defined me. The woman who had once balanced multiple investment accounts and helped business owners solve complex financial problems had been reduced to someone who needed permission to buy new clothes or go out to lunch with friends. I had retained all of my accounting knowledge and skills, but I had stopped applying them to my own life. I had allowed Mike to convince me that being a good wife meant trusting him to handle our finances, that questioning his decisions or wanting to maintain independent control over money was somehow selfish or inconsistent with true partnership. The irony was that throughout this entire transformation, Mike often praised my financial intelligence and asked for my advice on work-related money matters. He respected my professional expertise when it benefited him, but he had successfully convinced me that applying that same expertise to our personal finances would be inappropriate and damaging to our relationship. It would take a major crisis for me to remember who I used to be, and to recognize that the skills and instincts that had once made me financially independent were still inside me, waiting to be activated again. The morning that everything began to unravel started like any other Wednesday in March. Emma had been particularly difficult the night before, fighting bedtime and waking up twice with what she claimed were bad dreams. But what I suspected was simply a 4-year-old's desire for extra attention. I felt exhausted and slightly behind schedule as I rushed to pack Mike's lunch and get Emma ready for her half-day preschool program. Mike seemed unusually cheerful despite the disrupted night, humming while he shaved and taking extra care with his appearance. He chose his best navy suit, the one I had convinced him to buy for special occasions, and spent several minutes adjusting his tie in the mirror. "Big day today?" I asked, trying to sound conversational rather than curious. Over the years, I had learned to gauge Mike's moods and energy levels, adapting my own behavior to match what he seemed to need from me on any given day. "Just a regular client meeting," he said, but there was something in his tone that didn't quite match the casual words. A hint of excitement or nervousness that seemed disproportionate to a routine business appointment. I didn't push for details. Mike had made it clear early in our marriage that he preferred to decompress after work rather than give me detailed accounts of his daily activities. "I don't want to bore you with office politics and sales strategies," he would say when I asked about his day. "Home should be a place where I can forget about work stress." After Mike left for the office and I dropped Emma at preschool, I found myself with 3 uninterrupted hours, a rare luxury that I usually spent on household projects or errands. But something about Mike's behavior that morning had left me feeling unsettled, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. Instead of starting the laundry or grocery shopping as I had planned, I decided to tackle a project I had been avoiding for months, organizing Mike's home office. The small room that served as his workspace had become increasingly chaotic over the past year, with papers scattered across his desk, files stacked in precarious piles, and unopened mail accumulating in boxes he claimed he would sort through eventually. Mike had always been protective of his office space, asking me not to clean or organize in there because he had his own system and didn't want anything moved or misplaced. But the clutter had reached a point where it was starting to overflow into other parts of the house, and I figured that organizing, not rearranging, just organizing, would be a helpful surprise that he would appreciate. I started with the most obvious targets: old magazines that could be recycled, empty coffee cups that needed to be returned to the kitchen, and clearly outdated paperwork that was taking up space unnecessarily. As I worked, I found myself falling back into the methodical mindset that had served me well during my accounting career, sorting papers by category, checking dates for relevance, creating logical filing systems. It was while I was organizing a stack of mail that had been sitting on Mike's desk for weeks that I found the credit card statement. The envelope was already opened, but the statement itself was folded and tucked beneath a pile of sales reports as if Mike had reviewed it quickly and then tried to hide it or forget about it. At first glance, it looked like a normal monthly statement for one of our joint credit cards. But as I studied the charges more carefully, I realized I didn't recognize most of the transactions. There were restaurant charges for places I had never been, including several that occurred on evenings when Mike had told me he was working late at the office. There were charges for gas stations in parts of Denver I couldn't remember visiting, and hotel charges that didn't correspond to any business trips I knew about. But the charge that made my stomach drop was a recurring monthly payment to something called Bella Rosa Salon and Spa, $300 every 2 weeks, like clockwork, for the past 6 months. I sat in Mike's desk chair, staring at the statement and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I hadn't been to a salon in over 2 years. Mike was constantly reminding me that we needed to be careful with discretionary spending, that luxuries like professional hair care and spa treatments were expenses we couldn't justify given our other financial priorities. When I had mentioned wanting to get highlights for my birthday 6 months ago, he had suggested I try doing them myself at home with a kit from the drugstore. Yet here was evidence that someone was spending $600 a month at an upscale salon and spa, and those charges were being paid with our joint credit card. My first instinct was to look for an innocent explanation. Maybe the charges were a mistake, a case of credit card fraud that Mike hadn't noticed yet. Maybe Bella Rosa was a business expense that Mike was planning to get reimbursed for somehow. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation that I wasn't seeing because I didn't have all the information. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was looking at, my accounting background was automatically analyzing the pattern of charges. The salon visits occurred every other Wednesday and Friday, a schedule that was too regular to be coincidental. The amounts were consistent, suggesting ongoing services rather than one-time purchases. And the timing corresponded perfectly with several of the restaurant charges, as if someone was making a day of it. Salon appointment followed by an expensive dinner. I found myself studying the restaurant charges with new eyes. Chez Laurent was a French restaurant downtown that Mike and I had talked about trying for our anniversary, but decided was too expensive. Casa Bonita was a romantic Italian place that had gotten excellent reviews in the local food magazine. These weren't business meal locations. They were date night restaurants, the kind of places couples went to impress each other. The hotel charges were even more troubling. They were all local hotels, not travel accommodations, but same-city bookings that could only mean one thing. Someone was paying for hotel rooms in Denver on evenings when they could have gone home, which meant someone was using those rooms for purposes that couldn't happen at home. I sat in that office chair for nearly an hour, reading and rereading the credit card statement, hoping that somehow the charges would start making sense, or that I would find some detail I had missed that would provide an innocent explanation. But the more I studied the pattern, the more obvious it became that Mike was spending significant amounts of money on activities that didn't include me, and that he had actively hidden from me. The financial betrayal felt almost as shocking as the implied infidelity. For months, Mike had been telling me that we couldn't afford things I wanted: new clothes, dinner out with friends, small home improvements that would have made our daily life more comfortable. He had made me feel guilty for wanting to spend money on myself, made me believe that every dollar needed to be carefully allocated and justified. Yet he had been spending freely on someone else, someone who was receiving the kind of regular salon treatments and expensive dinners that I had been trained to see as irresponsible luxury spending. I thought about all the times I had talked myself out of buying something because I knew Mike would ask whether it was really necessary. All the times I had chosen the cheaper option or gone without rather than defend my desires to someone who controlled our family's purse strings. All the times I had felt selfish for wanting things that this credit card statement proved Mike was buying for someone else without apparent concern for our budget. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was financial. Mike had used our shared money that included my contributions and sacrifices, to fund a secret relationship. He had made me complicit in financing his affair by convincing me that we couldn't afford the things I wanted while freely spending on someone else's desires. As the initial shock began to wear off, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the analytical clarity that had once made me good at my job. I began to see Mike's behavior through the lens of financial investigation rather than personal relationship dynamics. The unexplained charges weren't just evidence of infidelity, they were evidence of financial deception and possibly fraud. I started making mental notes of questions that needed answers. How long had this pattern been going on? Were there other credit cards or accounts I didn't know about? Had Mike been systematically hiding expenses from me, or was this a recent development? How much money had been spent on this secret relationship, and where had Mike told me that money was going instead? For the first time in years, I felt like myself again, not Mike's wife or Emma's mother, but Jessica Chen, the accountant who knew how to follow a paper trail and uncover hidden financial activities. I remembered what it felt like to trust my own analytical skills and to believe that I could figure out complex problems by gathering and examining evidence. I also realized that I had been allowing Mike to make me financially helpless when I actually possessed all the skills I needed to understand and control our family's financial situation. I had stopped paying attention to our accounts and expenses not because I couldn't understand them, but because Mike had convinced me that doing so would be inappropriate or harmful to our relationship. But now that I suspected Mike was lying to me about our finances, I had every right to investigate. In fact, I had a responsibility to protect myself and Emma by understanding the true state of our financial affairs. The woman who had once helped business owners detect embezzlement and fraud was perfectly capable of auditing her own husband's financial behavior. And if Mike was doing what I suspected he was doing, I was going to find out exactly how extensive the deception had become. I carefully returned the credit card statement to exactly where I had found it, making sure the office looked undisturbed. Then I went to our bedroom and retrieved my laptop from the closet where it had been gathering dust since Emma was born. It was time to start paying attention to our family's finances again, whether Mike wanted me to or not. As I opened the laptop and waited for it to boot up, I felt a familiar excitement that I hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of beginning an investigation that I knew I had the skills to complete successfully. Mike had underestimated me for so long that he had forgotten who I used to be. But I was about to remind him and myself that Jessica Chen was nobody's fool. The 3 weeks that followed my discovery of the credit card statement were unlike any period in my marriage. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living a double life, maintaining the facade of the trusting, compliant wife, while secretly conducting the most important financial investigation of my career. Every morning after Mike left for work and Emma went to preschool, I would settle into what had once been my familiar routine of analyzing financial documents and tracking inconsistencies. But instead of auditing a client's business accounts, I was auditing my own life, and what I discovered was more extensive and damaging than I had initially imagined. I started by gaining access to all of our joint accounts online, something I hadn't done systematically in over 3 years. Mike had set up all the passwords and handled all the online banking, but fortunately, most financial institutions had updated their security systems to allow access through identity verification rather than password recovery. As an authorized user on all our accounts, I could regain access by answering security questions and providing personal information. What I found when I began examining our financial records in detail was a pattern of deception that went far beyond the salon charges and restaurant bills I had initially discovered. Mike had been systematically hiding expenses from me for at least 18 months, possibly longer. There were multiple credit cards I didn't know existed, all in Mike's name but connected to our joint accounts for payment purposes. These cards showed hundreds of charges that had never appeared on the statements Mike shared with me. Expensive clothing purchases, electronics, weekend trips to mountain resorts, and recurring payments for services I couldn't identify. More troubling was the discovery that Mike had been transferring money from our joint savings account into a personal checking account that he had opened without telling me. The transfers were irregular in timing but substantial in amount, sometimes $2,000 or $3,000 at a time, usually coinciding with his paycheck deposits, so that the overall account balance wouldn't fluctuate dramatically enough to raise questions if I happened to check. The personal account, which I could see referenced in our joint account transfer records but couldn't access directly, appeared to be funding a lifestyle that was completely separate from the one we were supposedly living together. Based on the transfer amounts and timing, Mike had moved nearly $20,000 from our shared savings into his personal account over the past year. This was money that I had believed was being saved for Emma's college fund, for a future house down payment, for the family vacation we kept saying we would take when we could afford it. Money that Mike claimed was too precious to spend on my personal desires was being diverted to fund expenses I wasn't allowed to see or question. But perhaps most shocking was my discovery that our overall financial situation was significantly better than Mike had been telling me. Our joint checking account typically maintained a balance that was 3 times higher than the amount Mike claimed we had available for discretionary spending. Our investment accounts had grown substantially over the past few years, but Mike had never mentioned these gains when discussing our budget constraints. We were not, as Mike had led me to believe, living paycheck to paycheck with little room for extras. We were actually quite comfortable financially, with healthy savings and investment balances that would have allowed us to afford many of the things I had trained myself not to want. Mike had been using artificial scarcity as a tool to control my spending and my expectations. By convincing me that money was always tight, he had eliminated my desire to question his financial decisions or to advocate for my own needs and preferences. I had become grateful for small allowances and apologetic about modest desires because I believed our family was struggling financially when we were actually quite secure. The psychological impact of these discoveries was almost overwhelming. I felt manipulated and betrayed in ways that went far beyond the implied infidelity. Mike had stolen my agency and my voice by lying to me about our fundamental capacity to make choices about our life together. He had made me complicit in my own financial abuse by convincing me to police my own desires and to feel guilty about wants that we could easily have afforded. I also felt angry at myself for being so passive, for allowing my professional skills to atrophy to the point where I could be deceived about something as basic as our family's financial health. The woman I used to be would never have allowed someone else to control her access to financial information, would never have accepted vague reassurances about money being tight without demanding to see actual account balances and budget breakdowns. But alongside the anger and betrayal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: confidence in my own ability to handle whatever came next. The skills that had made me successful in my accounting career were still sharp, still effective. I could still analyze complex financial situations, identify patterns and inconsistencies, and develop strategies for addressing problems. More importantly, I was beginning to remember what it felt like to trust my own judgment about important matters. For years, I had deferred to Mike's opinions and decisions, assuming that his perspective was more reliable than my own. But now I had objective evidence that Mike's judgment was compromised by dishonesty and self-interest, while my analytical skills were as strong as ever. Armed with detailed documentation of Mike's financial deception, I decided it was time to confront him directly. I had spent 3 weeks gathering evidence and developing a complete picture of our true financial situation. I knew exactly how much money we had, where it was located, how much had been hidden from me, and what our real budget capacity looked like. I also had a clear sense of what I wanted from the confrontation. This wasn't going to be an emotional plea for honesty or a request for reassurance about our relationship. This was going to be a business-like presentation of facts and a demand for immediate transparency and change. I chose a Saturday evening when Emma was having a sleepover at my sister's house, ensuring that we would have privacy and that any discussion wouldn't be interrupted or overheard. I prepared for the conversation the same way I used to prepare for difficult client meetings, with organized documentation, specific talking points, and clear objectives. When Mike came home from what he claimed was a morning golf game with colleagues, I was waiting in the living room with a folder of printed account statements and a legal pad filled with questions and observations. "We need to talk about our finances," I said without preamble, gesturing for him to sit down across from me. Mike looked immediately uncomfortable, but he tried to maintain his usual dismissive tone. "Jess, I told you I handle all that stuff. Is there something specific you need money for?" "Because I thought we agreed." "We didn't agree to anything," I interrupted, opening the folder and pulling out the credit card statement I had found in his office. "We agreed to combine our finances and make decisions together. We didn't agree that you would lie to me about where our money goes and how much we actually have." I placed the statement on the coffee table between us, pointing to the highlighted charges for Bella Rosa Salon and Spa. "I'd like you to explain these charges, please." Mike glanced at the statement, and I watched his face go through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and then a kind of defensive irritation that I recognized from previous conversations where I had questioned his decisions. "You went through my papers?" he said, focusing on my investigation rather than addressing the charges themselves. "I organized your office because it was getting cluttered. But yes, I found this, and yes, I want an explanation." "Jess, those charges aren't what you think they are." "Then tell me what they are. Tell me why our joint credit card is being charged $600 a month for salon services that I'm not receiving." Mike was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him trying to decide how to handle the situation. I recognized the look. It was the same expression he got when dealing with difficult clients, when he was calculating how much truth he needed to tell to resolve a problem without creating larger complications. "They're for Brittany," he said finally. "She's my colleague in marketing, and she's been going through a difficult time personally. I've been helping her out with some expenses." The explanation was so inadequate that I almost laughed. "You've been paying for your female colleague's salon treatments for 6 months?" "It's not like that, Jess. She's a friend who needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. It's temporary." "And the restaurant charges? The hotel rooms? Are those also charity for your colleague?" Mike's expression shifted again, and I could see him realizing that I had found more than just the salon charges. "How much of my stuff did you go through?" "Enough," I said, pulling out printed statements from our other accounts. "I know about the personal checking account. I know about the transfers from our savings. I know about the credit cards you've been hiding from me." I spread the papers across the coffee table like evidence in a courtroom. "And I know that you've been lying to me about our financial situation for months, maybe years." Mike stared at the documents for a moment, and then looked back at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger or defensiveness, but something like fear. "Jess, I can explain all of this." "Then do it," I said, picking up my legal pad. "Explain why you told me we couldn't afford for me to get my hair done professionally while you were paying for someone else's salon treatments. Explain why you said we needed to be careful about grocery spending while you were transferring thousands of dollars into a secret account. Explain why you made me feel guilty about wanting things we could easily afford." For the first time in our marriage, Mike seemed to realize that he was dealing with someone who couldn't be manipulated or dismissed. I wasn't asking these questions as his hurt wife looking for reassurance. I was asking them as an accountant who had identified financial irregularities and demanded a full explanation. And for the first time in years, I felt like myself again, competent, analytical, and completely unwilling to accept anything less than the truth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.